Pacific Northwest in winter was no stranger to storms, but this one was relentless. The wind howled through the towering pines, carrying snow sideways and blurring the world into a swirl of white. My truck shuddered with every gust, the headlights barely cutting through the storm as I navigated the twisting back roads. I'd been driving to a remote job site, a new lumber contract deep into the woods. My boss had warned me about the weather, but I figured I'd dealt with worse before. I was wrong. The truck sputtered and lurched before dying entirely, its tires crunching to a stop in the thickening snow. Damn it, I muttered, slamming my fist on the steering wheel. I stepped out, the wind immediately slicing through my coat and biting at my face. The road ahead and behind was empty, a tunnel of snow and trees. I popped the hood, but the engine was a mess of ice and steam. It wasn't going anywhere. The storm was growing worse, and the daylight was already fading. I grabbed my pack and flashlight from the cab, making sure I had my knife strapped to my belt. Years of hiking had taught me to always be prepared, but the thought of trekking through this storm was daunting. I remembered passing a small cabin about a mile back. It had looked abandoned, but it was better than freezing to death out here. Pulling my hood tight, I started walking. The forest was eerily silent beneath the howl of the wind. Snow muffled everything, and the trees seemed to close in as I trudged along the road. I thought about my family back in Minnesota. My dad, a lumberjack like me, always said the woods had a way of humbling a man. He'd been right. The cabin loomed out of the storm, a dark silhouette against the white. Its windows were broken and the door hung ajar, creaking softly in the wind. "Hello," I called, stepping inside. My voice echoed in the empty space. The interior was a mess of broken furniture and scattered debris, but the fireplace was intact, and there was a stack of wood in the corner. I lit a fire and huddled close, my hands trembling from the cold. The storm raged on outside, but the fire's warmth was a small comfort. As I sat there, I thought about an article I'd read years ago in one of those yellow newspapers, the kind that talked about UFOs and cryptids. It had been about strange sightings in the Pacific Northwest, creatures that prowled the woods, leaving behind massive footprints and claw marks. I'd laughed it off at the time, but now, sitting alone in this cabin with the storm howling outside, the memory sent a chill down my spine. A sudden noise snapped me out of my thoughts. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, a low guttural growl. I froze, straining to hear. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a crunch of snow. Gripping my knife, I moved to the window and peered out. The storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet, but I caught movement, a dark shape moving between the trees. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window. The creature circled the cabin, its footsteps deliberate, predatory. Then silence. I held my breath, listening. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and the thing lunged inside. It was massive, its form obscured by the storm's shadows, but its glowing eyes locked onto me with terrifying intelligence. I swung my knife as it charged, its claws swiping through the air. The blade connected, but it barely flinched, roaring with rage. The fight was a blur of chaos and blood. I managed to roll out of its grasp, grabbing a burning log from the fireplace and jamming it into its side. The creature howled, retreating into the storm, leaving behind a trail of dark, steaming blood. I didn't wait to see if it would return. Grabbing my pack, I bolted into the woods. The storm was disorienting, but adrenaline kept me moving. I knew the main road wasn't far, and if I could make it there, I had a chance. The creature wasn't done. I could hear it crashing through the trees, its growls growing louder. I threw myself behind the fallen log, holding my breath as it passed just feet away. When I finally reached the road, I saw headlights cutting through the storm. A truck was approaching, and I stumbled into its path, waving my arms. The driver slammed on the brakes, jumping out to help me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his face pale with concern. "Something's out there," I gasped, pointing toward the woods. He didn't ask questions, just pulled me into the truck and drove. As we sped away, I looked back. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, watching us, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. The Louisiana summer was heavy with heat, the air thick and oppressive even as the sun dipped below the treetops. Chuck Raftery, a Seattle police officer who'd grown up in the mild drizzle of the Pacific Northwest, wasn't used to this kind of heat. His friends teased him about it as they set up their tents, sweat dripping from their brows. "You're melting, man," joked Adam, tossing Chuck a bottle of water. Chuck smirked, cracking it open. "This is what you call fun? Sweating buckets while the mosquitoes drink you dry?" "I don't see you backing out," said Sarah, one of their mutual friends. She was crouched by the fire pit, stacking logs and kindling. Chuck had agreed to the trip reluctantly. He preferred his vacation with a good meal and a comfortable kitchen to experiment in. Camping was Adam's idea, a chance to get away from it all. The bayou stretched around them, endless swamps dotted with cypress trees draped in Spanish moss. The ground smelled damp, earthy, and alive. Chuck couldn't deny the beauty though. The swamp had a charm that grew on you, a haunting stillness broken only by the occasional rustle in the underbrush or the distant call of a heron. By the time night fell, they had a good fire going, its flames dancing in the growing darkness. The air was calm, the cicadas filling the silence with their endless drone. Chuck leaned back in his camping chair, watching the flames as Adam passed around marshmallows. It was Sarah who broke the peace. "You guys ever hear about the stories down here?" she asked, her voice low and conspiratorial. Chuck raised an eyebrow. "Stories? About shapeshifters, skinwalkers?" Adam groaned. "Here we go." "No, seriously," Sarah insisted. "They say there are creatures in the swamp that can mimic voices, even appearances. They lure people out, pretending to be someone you know." Chuck chuckled nervously, but his mind flashed back to a late night in the station. He'd been reading strange reports from rural areas, a combination of curiosity and boredom. Stories about creatures that defied explanation, predators that thrived on fear. "Well, let's hope they aren't hungry tonight," he said, trying to keep the mood light. The night passed uneventfully, though Chuck had trouble sleeping. The humid air clung to him, and the unfamiliar sounds of the swamp kept him on edge. The next day was uneventful but exhausting. They explored a nearby trail, stopping to take photos of gnarled trees and slow-moving waterways. By the time they returned to camp, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. That's when the noises started. At first it was subtle, a distant rustling in the trees. Chuck dismissed it as an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but as they sat around the fire again, the sound grew louder, closer. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. Adam shrugged. "It's the swamp. Everything makes noise." Chuck wasn't so sure. The rustling was so deliberate, too slow. It circled their camp, staying just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Then came the sound of footsteps. "Adam?" They all froze. The voice was unmistakable, but it hadn't come from Adam. "Adam?" It called again, closer this time. Chuck felt his blood run cold. He stood, his flashlight trembling in his hand, and scanned the trees. "Who's out there?" he called. Silence. "Stay close to the fire," Chuck ordered, his training kicking in. He reached for the knife strapped to his belt, his heart pounding. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. "Help me." Sarah grabbed Chuck's arm. "That sounded like me," she whispered. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the camp. Then out of the darkness, a figure appeared. It looked human at first, but as it moved closer, its gait was wrong, jerky, and unnatural. "Get back!" Chuck shouted, brandishing his knife. The thing paused at the edge of the firelight, its face obscured by shadow. Then it smiled, a grotesque, inhuman grin that stretched too far. Chaos erupted. The creature lunged, moving faster than seemed possible. Adam threw a burning log at it, and the thing shrieked, retreating into the woods. "We need to go," Chuck said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through him. They grabbed their packs and doused the fire, the creature's shrieks echoing in the distance. Moving as silently as possible, they made their way through the trees, sticking close together. The creature toyed with them, its voice calling out from different directions. Sometimes it sounded like Adam, sometimes Sarah. Once it even mimicked Chuck's own voice, a chilling echo that sent shivers down his spine. They stumbled upon an old, abandoned shack, its walls covered in moss. Chuck led them inside, barricading the door with rotting furniture. "We stay quiet," he whispered, gripping his knife. The night dragged on, every noise outside magnified by their fear. The creature scratched at the walls, its guttural growls punctuating the silence. When dawn finally broke, the sound stopped. They waited until the sun was high before venturing out, their legs weak from exhaustion. They found their way back to the trail and finally to the safety of their car. As they sped away, Chuck glanced back at the swamp. The creature stood at the tree line, watching them, its grotesque grin the last thing he saw before the road turned. The air in Bladenboro, North Carolina, was thick with the kind of humidity that made even breathing feel like work. Sam Calhoun adjusted the strap on his hiking pack and glanced at the group of fellow travelers milling around the small dock. This fishing trip, organized by an enthusiastic local travel agency, had seemed like a good way to take a break from Chicago's grind and try something new. The agency had promised days of quiet fishing, nights under the stars, and all the charm that rural South could offer. Sam was skeptical about the charm, but he was no stranger to solitude. Hiking the forest preserves around Chicago was his escape when the fluorescent lights of IT work threatened to drive him mad. Rain clouds loomed on the horizon as their guide, a wiry man named Earl, loaded their gear into a rickety flat-bottomed boat. "Rain's normal this time of year," Earl said, as though reading Sam's mind. "Just adds to the experience." The group of 7, including Earl, set out across a slow-moving river that cut through a dense forest. Sam noticed how quiet it was. No traffic, no distant hum of the city, just water lapping against the boat and the occasional bird call. By the time they reached the campsite, the clouds had moved closer, darkening the sky. The group worked together to set up tents and gather firewood while Earl prepared fishing gear. "You ever heard of the Beast of Bladenboro?" Earl asked later as they sat around the fire. Sam raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like a local legend." Earl grinned, his teeth catching the firelight. "They say it's a huge animal, maybe a cat, maybe not, that prowled our area back in the 50s. People thought it was gone, but folks still see things sometimes, strange things." "Probably just a bear," someone muttered. Sam wasn't so sure. Growing up, he'd heard plenty of stories during camping trips with his dad, tales meant to keep kids from wandering off into the woods. Still, there was a different edge to Earl's voice and conviction that made the hairs on the back of Sam's neck stand up. That night, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. Sam lay in his tent, listening to the patter of water against the nylon and the distant rumble of thunder. He must have drifted off, because he woke to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the rain or the wind, it was heavier, deliberate. Sam froze, straining to hear over the drumming rain. A low growl cut through the night, sending a chill down his spine. He sat up, fumbling for the flashlight by his sleeping bag. "Earl?" he called softly. No answer. He unzipped the tent and stepped out into the downpour. The fire was out, but the embers still glowed faintly. The campsite was eerily quiet. "Sam, over here." He turned startled to see one of the others, Lisa, crouched near the edge of the trees. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" "Something's out there," she whispered. Before he could respond, a branch snapped in the woods, loud enough to make them both jump. Sam swung the flashlight toward the sound, the beam cutting through the rain and shadows. At first he saw nothing, then something moved. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. The eyes reflected the light, glowing an unnatural yellow. "Run!" Lisa breathed. They bolted for the boats, shouting for the others. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream that echoed through the forest. Earl appeared, his rifle in hand. "What the hell is that?" he yelled, but before anyone could answer, the thing charged. It moved with terrifying speed, slamming into Earl and sending him sprawling. Sam grabbed the paddle from the boat and swung it wildly, trying to keep the creature at bay. "Get to the boat!" he shouted. The group scrambled, hauling Earl's limp form into one of the boats. The creature lurked at the edge of the water, pacing, its glowing eyes never leaving them. Sam rowed with all his strength, the rain blinding him, his muscles screaming. The creature didn't follow, but let out another scream that made his blood curdle. When they reached the main dock hours later, they were soaked and shaking. Earl was alive but unconscious, his chest clawed and bleeding. They piled into the agency's van and sped away without looking back. Sam stared out the window as the forest disappeared behind them, his mind racing. He'd heard stories of the Rugaru before, a creature from Native American lore, said to stalk those who broke taboos or strayed too far into the wild. It fed on fear, its presence a harbinger of doom. Whether it was a Rugaru or something else, Sam knew he'd never forget those eyes, that scream. The leaves crunched underfoot as Nickwick trudged through the woods, the earthy smell of decaying foliage heavy in the damp autumn air. The trees above were a riot of amber and crimson, their beauty dimmed by the oppressive grey sky. Rain was coming. Nick adjusted the strap of his hunting rifle and scanned the trail ahead. A faint drizzle had already begun, dotting the forest floor with dark spots. Hunting in Michigan during the fall was supposed to be relaxing, a break from his job as a police officer in Boulder, where the constant hum of crime and chaos left little room for peace. The trip had been planned months ago with his friend Paul, another officer who had grown up in Michigan. He'd set up a camp near an isolated lake miles from the end town, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was perfect. "This storm's gonna get worse," Paul said, breaking the silence. He carried a shotgun slung over his shoulder, his steps deliberate as he scanned for tracks. "We should head back soon." Nick nodded, though he hated the idea of leaving empty-handed. A buck had passed through earlier. They'd found fresh tracks, but the animal was long gone by the time they'd reached the clearing. "We can try again tomorrow," Paul added, as if reading Nick's thoughts. They turned back toward camp and drizzle turning into a steady rain. Nick's thoughts wandered to Boulder. He'd grown up hiking the Flatiron with his dad, who taught him how to hunt and fish, skills that felt archaic in the modern world, but still gave him a sense of purpose. His dad's rifle was the one slung over his shoulder now, a link to memories of simpler times. As they reached the camp, the rain picked up, and the fire they'd left smoldering had nearly gone out. Nick crouched to rekindle it, the flames flickering to life against the encroaching darkness. "Something's off," Paul muttered, staring into the woods. Nick followed his gaze. The forest, usually alive with the sounds of insects and small animals, was unnaturally quiet. "You think it's a bear?" Nick asked. Paul shook his head. "Too quiet for a bear." The hours passed uneventfully, though neither of them relaxed. Nick sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts drifting to his mom back in Boulder. She'd been proud of him when he joined the force, though she worried constantly. His reverie was shattered by a guttural growl, low and menacing. Nick froze, his hand instinctively going for his rifle. Paul was already on his feet, shotgun in hand. "What the hell was that?" Nick whispered. The growl came again, closer this time. The firelight cast long shadows, and for a moment Nick thought he saw something move just beyond the tree line. Then it stepped into view. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with matted fur and hunched posture. Its eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and its elongated snout revealed rows of jagged teeth. "Run!" Paul shouted, firing his shotgun. The creature howled, the sound primal and ear-splitting, and charged. Nick grabbed his rifle and fired, but the shots barely slowed it down. The creature slammed into Paul, sending him flying into a tree with a sickening crack. Nick's stomach lurched as he saw his friend crumple to the ground, unmoving. Adrenaline took over. Nick ran, not daring to look back. The rain was a downpour now, the forest a blur of wet leaves and mud. He stumbled, falling hard, but scrambled to his feet and kept going. He finally stopped, panting, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature's howl echoed through the forest, but it sounded farther away. Nick huddled under a dense thicket, his rifle clutched tightly. The rain masked his scent, he hoped, and the darkness would keep him hidden. He thought of his dad's hunting advice: stay calm, think. Hours passed. The creature's howls grew sporadic, then stopped. Nick didn't dare move until dawn, when the first light filtered through the trees. Creeping back to camp, he found the site destroyed. Paul's body was gone, blood smeared across the ground. Nick didn't wait to investigate further. He packed what he could carry and started the long hike back to the trailhead, every step deliberate, every sound making his pulse quicken. It wasn't until he reached his truck that he allowed himself to breathe. Driving away, his hands shaking on the wheel, Nick replayed the night over and over. Later, he'd learn about the Michigan dogman, Cryptid, said to haunt the state's forests, a werewolf, some called it. Nick didn't care what it was. All he knew was that he'd never set foot in those woods again. Thank you for listening, everyone. Have a good night.